The morning she set out, the sky was clear, the prairie calm, and everything pointed toward joy. Clara Dorsey rode with her wedding dress carefully packed in her saddlebag, bound for the church 2 towns over where her groom waited. The townsfolk had insisted she not travel alone, but Clara was no stranger to open country. Besides, the trail was one she'd ridden since childhood. Past the ridgeline, through the cottonwoods, across the shallow river where the water always ran cold and clear. But when she reached the crossing, something shifted. Her mare, Lacey, stopped dead at the riverbank, nostrils flaring, hooves rooted. "Come on, girl," Clara urged gently, patting her neck. "Just a little further." But the horse wouldn't budge. Her muscles trembled beneath the saddle. Clara dismounted, puzzled, and led Lacey forward by the reins. That's when she saw it, just under the surface, tangled in a nest of reeds and roots, white fabric, soaked, drifting like a ghost's breath. She stepped closer. It wasn't just cloth. It was a dress, long, lacy, the kind worn for vows and promises, the kind not meant to end up here. Her boots splashed into the water as she knelt to retrieve it. It came loose easily, like it had been waiting. Mud streaked the hem, and red stained the front. Dark, dried, unmistakable. Clara stared at the bodice, her hands suddenly shaking. Her mind reeled backward. 5 years ago, her older sister, June, engaged to marry a man no one in town really knew, a rancher who came from nowhere and promised everything. But June vanished the night before her wedding. They searched, dug, wept, found nothing but her horse, returned bloodied to the stable. Folks whispered she'd run. Others said she'd died by her own hand. Clara never believed either. Now, in her arms, lay a dress nearly identical to the one June had been buried in. Only this one had never seen a coffin. And she knew, without understanding how, that this river hadn't just refused the horse. It had refused the lie. She stood in the cold current, soaked to the waist, the dress hanging heavy in her grip. Lacey still wouldn't come near. Wind brushed the tall grass, whispering through the trees as if the land remembered. Clara looked back toward the horizon, the way she'd come, toward the town where her own wedding waited, where her groom waited, and suddenly, she didn't want to go forward anymore. She wanted answers, and she had a feeling she already knew where to start looking. Clara rode back through the cottonwoods with the wet wedding dress bundled tight behind her, her mind unraveling faster than the trail beneath her. At home, she entered the parlor in silence, unwrapping the dress and laying it gently across the table like a body returned from war. The lace was unmistakable. It was June's. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the stack of invitations tied neatly with twine, pulling one free to study the name again. Mr. Daniel Corwin and Miss Clara Dorsey. But something in her memory clawed its way forward, an old letter tucked inside the family Bible, an invitation her father refused to burn even after June vanished. She dug for it, breath held tight in her chest, and when she found it, the weight of truth nearly dropped her to her knees. It read the same as her own, only older, faded. Mr. Daniel Corwin and Miss June Dorsey, March 17th. The same man, the same date, 5 years apart. He hadn't come for Clara. He had returned for the wedding he never finished. The realization made her nauseous. Her groom hadn't courted her heart. He had studied her grief, waited for her softness to ripen, then slid into her world like a second shadow. She laid both invitations side by side, June's dress spread between them, and saw the shape of it all. A circle of deception that began with blood and would end the same way unless she broke it. She went to the trunk under the stairs and pulled out the remnants of June's life. Pressed flowers, childish ribbons, and, to her surprise, a hidden pocket in the lining of the old diary. Inside was a small folded note in June's handwriting. A single sentence. "If he comes again, don't let him in." Clara stared at the words until her eyes blurred. Her sister had known. Maybe not exactly what would happen, but enough to fear it repeating. And it had. Only this time, the river had refused to stay quiet. Clara wasn't the soft girl Daniel thought she was. Not anymore. She was the last thread of her sister's voice, and she would not let it vanish beneath lace and vows. She packed the dress carefully, tucked both invitations inside her coat, and looked once more at the stillness outside. Tomorrow she would go to him. Not to say, "I do," but to ask why he thought he could kill a woman and marry her sister, as if the land itself would forget. The next morning, Clara didn't dress like a bride. She wore her riding pants, her oldest boots, and braided her hair like June used to, tight against the wind. The air outside was still, but inside her chest, a storm pressed in. Her father sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, his eyes tired from years of grief he never learned how to name. He looked up, surprised. "I thought you'd be heading back by now. Daniel's likely worried." Clara set both wedding invitations on the table between them, hers and June's. "You remember this name?" Her father frowned, picking them up. His eyes narrowed as he compared the dates. "What is this?" "He was June's fiancé." "No," he said too quickly. "That can't be. That man he was named something else. James or John or—" "He lied," Clara said. "Changed it. Same man, same wedding date. 5 years apart." Her father rubbed his face, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I never saw his face. After June vanished, he left. The preacher said—" "The preacher lied," she snapped. "Everyone wanted to forget." But the river didn't. He looked up at her now, truly seeing her for the first time in years. "What did you find?" She untied the oilcloth bundle and slowly unrolled the blood-stained wedding dress across the table. Her father's hand shot to his mouth. "Lord have mercy." "It's June's," she said. "I don't know what happened, but I think I know who did it." The old man sat back, stunned. "We let him in again." Clara nodded. "And I let him close. I thought I was choosing love. I didn't see it coming." "What will you do?" "I'll go to him, but not as his bride." She stood, voice steady. "I'm going to ask him the same question I asked you, about the name, about the day she disappeared. And if he lies—" "You can't face him alone," her father said, his voice breaking. "He's dangerous." "So was grief," Clara whispered, "and I survived that." She stepped out into the pale morning light, mounted Lacey, and rode for the chapel where they were meant to be married. She had no veil, no bouquet, but she carried a truth too heavy for silence. As the town steeple came into view, her heart pounded louder than the hoofbeats. She would not ask for justice. She would bring it. And if Daniel Corwin was the man she believed he was, then this day would not end in vows. It would end in truth, no matter how much blood it cost to uncover it. The chapel stood quiet against the wind, its whitewashed boards catching the early sun like bones bleached by time. Clara dismounted slowly, her boots crunching the gravel path as she walked past the empty pews outside where chairs had been arranged for guests that had yet to arrive. Her heartbeat thundered as she pushed open the chapel door. Inside, everything was perfect. Fresh flowers, candles trimmed and ready. The scent of pine soap and old hymns lingered in the air. At the far end, under the arch draped in white fabric, stood Daniel Corwin. He turned as she entered, smiling. "You're early," he said. "I was worried when you didn't come yesterday." Clara stared at him. Tall, clean, handsome in a way that made people trust too quickly. "You wore the same suit," she said quietly. He tilted his head. Beg your pardon? 5 years ago, March 17th. Same suit, same date, same bride. His eyes didn't flinch, but his smile did. I don't know what you're talking about. She stepped closer, pulling the dress from her saddlebag and letting it unfold in her arms like a banner of war. The blood-stained lace gleamed in the sunlight, streaking through the stained glass. You didn't just lose June. You took her. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's enough. Is it? Because I think the land remembers what you tried to bury. My horse wouldn't cross the river yesterday. She felt it. And I found this just beneath the surface. He said nothing, but his hands curled into fists. Why? She asked. Why come back? Why me? Daniel's voice was low. Because you were quiet. Software. You didn't ask too many questions. He stepped down from the altar slowly. But I see now that was a mistake. You shouldn't have come back, she said, voice shaking. You shouldn't have worn the same name. He smiled again, but colder now. No one ever cared what happened to her. You think they'll care what happens to you? I don't need them to care, she whispered. I just need them to listen. She reached into her coat and pulled out June's old journal, the one she'd found tucked behind the baseboard back home. She tossed it at his feet. You should have burned this when you had the chance. His eyes dropped to the leather-bound book, pages weathered, some of them marked with dates, places, fears, witness, record, confession. She watched him hesitate, the mask cracking at the corners. For the first time, Clara saw the man beneath, the coward behind the charm. And she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Daniel didn't pick up the journal. He just stared at it, as if the sight of it burned more than fire ever could. Clara stood tall, her hands trembling only slightly at her sides. She knew now that he hadn't expected her to find it. That small brown book hidden beneath a loose floorboard in June's room. She hadn't even been looking for it. But grief has a way of pointing fingers. She'd followed instinct and dust and sorrow, and it had led her straight to her sister's voice. Daniel stepped toward her, slow and controlled. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing, she said, voice low but steady. She wrote everything. How you followed her, how she tried to leave, how you— That was a long time ago, he snapped, his calm shattering. And she chose to run. I didn't stop her. You didn't let her run, Clara said, her eyes narrowing. You stopped her at the river. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the stained glass window, where the morning sun painted broken colors across the pews. For a moment, she saw something strange, a flash of regret, or perhaps panic. She betrayed me, he said quietly. She said she loved me, then tried to leave in the night. Said the land wasn't right, that I wasn't right. Because you weren't, Clara whispered, and now you've tried again. Same path, same charm. You think love is something to trap, but love doesn't come with shackles. He moved again, faster this time, anger rising beneath his skin. Clara didn't flinch. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a folded telegram she'd sent 2 nights ago. This is from the sheriff in Elbridge County, she said. They've been looking for a man matching your description for over 6 years. She held it up between them. Disappearing brides, vanishing ranch deeds, fraud, assault, attempted murder. Daniel's face went white. He turned toward the door, but it opened before he could reach it. 2 men stepped inside, Deputy Franklin and Clara's father, both armed, eyes grim. Behind them, townsfolk gathered, called quietly by Clara's letters sent in secret the day before. This was never meant to be a wedding. It was meant to be a reckoning. Daniel froze as the deputy read the charges. Clara stepped back, the dress still in her arms, the blood dried but speaking louder than any preacher ever could. Outside, Lacey pawed the earth and turned toward the river. The wind shifted. Somewhere, Clara swore she could hear June's voice in the grass, whispering, "You brought me home. They took Daniel in chains. No fight, no struggle. Just the hollow silence of a man whose masks had all finally fallen." As the crowd dispersed, Clara stood alone on the chapel steps, June's journal clutched to her chest, and the ruined wedding dress bundled beneath her arm. Her father came beside her, quiet as he'd always been, but different now. He looked at her not as someone fragile, but as a woman who had brought the past to its knees. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I should have. About June. About him." "We all wanted to believe she left," Clara replied. "It was easier than believing someone we knew brought her pain." Her father nodded slowly, guilt writ deep across his weathered face. "What will you do now?" "Take her home," Clara said. "Properly this time." And so she did. That evening she rode alone back to the river, the same spot where Lacey had refused to cross, the dress now wrapped in white linen and tied with a ribbon from June's keepsake box. The sun was setting behind the cottonwoods, casting gold over the water. Lacey stopped again at the edge, ears flicking, but she didn't panic this time. Clara dismounted and stepped into the shallows, the current cool and steady. She moved to the same route where she'd found the dress days earlier. There, with slow hands, she placed the bundle down and began to dig a small hollow with her bare fingers. Not much. Just enough to bury what remained of a girl no one had mourned properly. "You should have had music," Clara whispered as she placed the bundle in the earth. "You should have had flowers and cake and someone to kiss you at the altar. But he took all that. So I'm giving you this." She pressed her hand to the ground, then leaned back as the water washed gently over the spot, as if the river itself was sealing the grave. She lit a single match and dropped it into the dry grass nearby, watching it catch and curl into a slow, respectful flame. Not to burn the dress this time, but to mark the place, to give the land something to remember. Behind her, the wind moved through the reeds. And just then, the strangest thing happened. A white heron landed on the opposite bank, tall and still, watching her. Clara smiled. "You always liked birds better than people," she said aloud, blinking away tears. The heron didn't move. Neither did she. Not until the last light dipped below the hills, and the fire died to smoke, and the river once again became just a river. But she knew. This time, it had let go. Clara spent the morning alone in the attic, drawn by something quieter than grief and heavier than memory. Among trunks filled with yellowed lace and cracked hymnals, she found a photograph tucked inside an old book. 3 figures standing before a weather-beaten barn, her father, clean-shaven and young, June, still girlish with a wide smile, and beside her, a man whose face was half-shadowed but unmistakable. The back read, "Henry Calden, Spring of '66, and the name hit Clara like a hammer. She studied the jawline, the posture, the stillness in his stance. It was him. Not Daniel Corwin, not the man waiting at the altar, but the same body wearing a different name. She rode to Millgate that afternoon with the photo, June's journal, and a heart full of purpose. Sheriff Alden read each page in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with every entry. And when Clara placed the photograph on his desk, he exhaled slow and grim. He opened an old file from years ago. Another bride, another town, another missing girl on the eve of a wedding. The groom had vanished, the only clue a forged deed signed Henry Calden. Clara didn't need confirmation. She'd already seen how he moved, how he lied, how he wore affection like a coat he could shed at will. That night, She printed broadsheets with her own money, walking through wind and shadow to nail them up across town. "Do you know this man?" It read, listing the aliases Daniel Corwin, Henry Calden, and urging other women to come forward. This wasn't just about June anymore. It wasn't just about what was taken. It was about all the girls who vanished, who were doubted, who never got to speak. Clara would be their voice, their lantern, their storm. And somewhere deep inside, she hoped her sister could feel it, that a lie buried beneath water had risen into something no name could hide. By the end of the week, letters began arriving, handwritten, tear-stained, trembling. Some were from women who had once worn lace and left towns under cover of shame. Others came from mothers who had lost daughters to accidents no one dared question. Each envelope bore the weight of someone who had been silenced, and every one of them described a man with a different name, but the same crooked smile, the same easy lies, the same empty promises that led to the same kind of grief. Clara read them all by candlelight in the kitchen, the stack growing higher by the day. Word spread that Daniel, or Henry, or whatever name he once wore, was being moved to the state penitentiary. The townsfolk who once politely nodded at him in the street now crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. But Clara didn't feel triumph. She felt the gravity of every bride who never made it to the altar. So she rode one final time to the river where it had all begun. Spring had softened the banks, and wildflowers now bloomed where the soil still remembered. She brought with her a stone marker, small, unpolished, carved with June's initials, and nothing more. She pressed it into the earth near the tree root where the dress had surfaced, and for a long moment she just stood there, letting the wind move through her braid, letting the quiet say what words could not. Behind her, Lacey grazed, peaceful now. The river didn't resist this time. It flowed steady, almost gentle, as if accepting the name finally spoken aloud. Clara thought of the other women, the ones who had sent letters but never had a place to mourn. So she opened June's journal, tore out the blank back pages, and carefully wrote down every name she'd received, one by one, folding the list and tucking it beneath the marker. Let it rest, she thought. Let them all rest. Then she stepped back, took one final look at the grave, and whispered, "You were never forgotten." The wind picked up slightly, just enough to stir the edge of her skirt and carry the words somewhere they might matter. When she mounted Lacey and turned toward home, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The river had already taken her sister once, but now it held her memory, not as a secret, but as a truth too heavy to stay buried. And Clara, for the first time in years, felt like someone walking toward life instead of away from it. It arrived folded in brown paper, tied with string, and bearing no return address, just Clara's name scrawled in the tight, careful handwriting of someone trying not to be recognized. Inside was a wedding dress, not the one she'd found in the river, not June's. This one was newer, untouched by blood or water, its lace unwrinkled, its seams unfinished. There was a note pinned to the bodice, written in the same hand. He ordered this for someone named Evelyn. "We never knew what happened to her. I thought you should have it." Clara stood in her parlor, the dress spread across the table like a fresh page, and felt her breath catch. Evelyn. Another name, another ghost, another story she might never fully learn. But this dress hadn't sunk. It had survived, tucked away by someone who had watched from a distance and stayed quiet for too long. She traced her fingers over the fabric, imagining the girl who might have worn it, the life she'd dreamed of, the vow that had never come. That night, Clara sat with June's journal, the broadsheet clippings, and the growing list of names. She started a second journal, clean, leather-bound, with no preface or title. On the first page, she wrote Evelyn's name. Below it, she wrote the town it came from, the date scribbled on the parcel's postal mark, and every detail the note had offered. The book wasn't for her. It was for the ones who came after, for the daughters who asked questions, for the women told to stay quiet. She catalogued every story she'd received, tracing a web of vanished women and false identities, cross-referencing ranch deeds and travel logs, patterns and routes. It was more than a mystery now. It was a ledger. One Daniel hadn't meant to leave behind. By the end of the week, she had mapped 3 aliases, 8 towns, and 12 women who'd vanished after placing their trust in the same charming stranger with a changing name. The authorities had their case, but Clara had something heavier. Proof that one man's evil had worn many coats, and a promise that his legacy wouldn't vanish into whispers. She folded the second dress with care and placed it in a cedar chest beside June's. It didn't belong to her, but someday someone might come looking, and when they did, she'd be ready to hand it over, not as a warning, but as a key. Because the river had taught her this. What we bury never stays buried. And truth, like lace in the current, always finds its way to the light. A month later, the town was quiet again, but not unchanged. Clara walked past the dressmaker's shop on Main Street, where a new gown stood displayed in the window. A simple piece, ivory with soft stitching and no veil, the kind of dress that spoke of strength rather than ceremony. It wasn't for sale. Beside it sat a small wooden sign carved by hand. In memory of the brides who never came home. People stopped to look now. They paused longer than they used to. Some placed flowers beneath the glass. Others left folded notes. Clara didn't need to read them to know what they said. She carried their stories already. At the edge of town, the chapel stood empty, never opened again since the day Daniel Corwin, or Henry Calden, or whatever name would be carved on the prison ledger, was led away in chains. The preacher had left town quietly, ashamed of what he hadn't seen, and the townsfolk no longer spoke his name. Justice had moved slowly, but it had moved, and Clara had made sure the trial was public. Every detail was read aloud, every name spoken with care. And in that courtroom, beneath the wide eyes of strangers and the weeping of mothers, Clara stood in her plain riding coat and told the truth. Not just for June, but for Evelyn, for all the others who never got to finish their stories. When she returned home, the riverbank had bloomed again. Wildflowers covered the grave she'd marked, and beside it, the stone stood firm, weathered now by wind and water. Clara sat beneath the cottonwood tree with Lacey grazing nearby and read aloud the last page of June's journal, the ink faded but still legible, where her sister had written, "If anything happens, I want to be remembered as someone who loved, even if it cost me." Clara closed the book and placed it gently beside the stone, then stood and brushed the dust from her hands. She wasn't wearing a wedding ring. She hadn't married. But she had chosen a vow to never let silence become safety again. As the sun dipped low behind the hills and the wind stirred her braid, she looked toward the horizon and smiled, not in triumph, but in peace. June had come home. The land had remembered. And somewhere out there, the next girl would no longer walk alone, not as long as Clara Dorsey drew breath and carried the truth like a banner stitched in lace and stormlight.